Thank you so much for coming tonight. Before I start, I wanted to thank some special members of the audience, my Aunt Judy, who is here to listen, and a group of people who are true heroes of mine, or the Afro-American Historical Association of Louisiana, who have fought for decades to keep this memory alive. So I wanted to give them a round of applause and thank them for their hard work. Today, January 8th, represents the 200th anniversary of the largest slave revolt in American history. Yet if you read the textbooks, whether it's the Louisiana history or American history, you won't find this revolt mentioned. In fact, there's a vast collective popular amnesia about the 1811 revolt that persists to this day. And so I'm very excited to be here on January 8th, which is the 200th anniversary of when the heroic slaves of 1811 launched their revolution and tried to conquer New Orleans. You might be wondering, why did the slaves pick January 8th, 1811, which is today, or 200 years ago today? And there are three reasons the slaves chose January 8th, 1811. Let me describe to you a scene. 1811, the planters gathered in balls. They cut open a king cake. It was January 6th, 12th night, or Epiphany. After cutting open the king cake, the slaves served coffee, and the dancing began. The guests danced boleros, gavottes, English dances, French dances. Elegantly yet dressed young men smoked and gambled at tables spread outside, on the outside of the room. You never saw anything more brilliant, wrote a French colonial official fresh from Paris. At 3 o'clock in the morning, slaves would bring in gumbo and turtle to serve at huge tables of 70 people each. After the initial parties, many of the planters would go on to mixed-race balls and other such celebrations. When William Claiborne, the American governor, took over control of the city in 1804, the French planters informed him that the only way they could win their loyalty was to hold a party. I want to read to you a description of what they served at that party. 196 bottles of Madeira, 144 bottles of champagne, 100 bottles of Hermitage wine, 67 bottles of brandy, 81 bottles of porter, 258 bottles of ale, and 11,360 Spanish cigars. The morning after that party seemed like a pretty good time to revolt. Now, the next reason the slaves chose January of 1811 is because in December and in the fall of 1810, William Claiborne, the governor, was waging a proxy war with Spain over West Florida. They had just conquered West Florida through an illegal military filibuster, and there was rumors in the air that the Spanish were going to send a counterattack from Cuba to retake Baton Rouge. In December, William Claiborne ordered the dragoons, who were the most skilled and trained and effective military force the Americans had here in New Orleans, out of the city and up to Baton Rouge to protect it from the Spanish. So the planters were drinking and celebrating Carnival, as we still celebrate Carnival here today. The American military was distracted fighting the Spanish in West Florida. And to top it all off, on January 4th, a rainstorm blew in. By January 6th, correspondents reported that the roads were a half leg deep in mud. Why was this rainstorm significant? For two reasons. The first is that rain meant that the slaves could not work. There was nothing to do on the plantations in the middle of the pouring rain. And the second was that it was impossible to move artillery, heavy artillery, when the roads were covered in mud. So the slave army, armed with cutlasses, cane knives, axes, and muskets, would be facing an American military whose strongest fighting force were hundreds of miles away, and who could not bring out their best weaponry from the city. It was a perfect time. I want to tell you a little bit about the leaders of the revolt. There were 11 separate leaders, and I'm going to talk about 4 of them. The first was a man named Charles Dillon, whose name I hope will be in every history textbook in the country in the next few months or years. Charles Dillon was an interesting man, to say the least. He was the son of a white planter, and he served as a driver on his plantation. Slave drivers were at the top of the hierarchy. Beneath the master was the overseer, beneath the overseer was the driver, and beneath the driver were the slaves. Charles Dillon administered the punishments on the other slaves. He held the keys to all of the doors in the plantation. When slaves escaped, he would help chase them down. Drivers like Charles were often regarded as betrayers of their race. And by the white planters, they were regarded as close accomplices, as trusted advisors. Charles would convene with his master every morning to discuss when the sugar would be planted and how the work was going. But Charles was doing something else with the liberties granted to him as a driver. On the weekends, he would visit his wife a few plantations down. And as he traveled, he would meet up with two men, Cook and Quamana, or Kwaku and Quamina in their native Ashanti tongue. Kwaku was over 6 feet tall, which at a time when the average height was around 5'4", was a looming figure. He was recently brought from Africa in 1806. The Ashanti Kingdom was a very warlike and powerful empire that spread over much of the coast of Africa. Kwaku and Quamina would meet with Charles, and they would discuss plans for what would become the largest revolt in American history. Charles Dillon, you see, was the ultimate sleeper cell, using his privileged position not to aid the planters, but to subvert them. On January 6th, 12th night, was the final meeting between these men, Charles Dillon, Harry Kenner, who also was the son of a white planter and was born in Virginia, and then Cook and Quamana, and they met together on January 6th. What did the slaves discuss? What were their motives? How did they organize? These are questions which no historian can answer definitively. The slaves did not write anything down, and they kept their actions completely secret from the planters. But let me tell you what the slaves would have known, what they would have been familiar with. I'm not sure how many of you know about the revolution that occurred in Haiti from 1791 to 1803. Today, I think when we think of Haiti, we think of those devastating scenes that we see on television. In 1811, Haiti was a beacon of hope to all slaves across the American Atlantic because Haiti was the site of the first successful slave revolt in the history of the New World. Not only was it a slave revolt, though, this was a political revolution. Black Haitians abolished slavery, declared racism illegal, and banned the French who settled Haiti or Santo Domingo, just like they settled here in New Orleans. I want to read to you from the Haitian Declaration of Independence, which I think can give you some sense of the political ideology that was flowing through the slave quarters. Jean-Jacques Dessalines proclaimed, "Let us imitate those people who, extending their concern into the future and dreading to leave an example of cowardice for posterity, preferred to be exterminated rather than lose their place as one of the world's free peoples." They went on, "May the French tremble when they approach our coasts, if not by the memory of the cruelty they have inflicted, at least by the terrible resolution that we are about to devote to death anyone born French who would dirty with his sacrilegious foot the land of liberty." Those are amazing words. How did the slaves here in Louisiana know about Haiti, an island 200 miles away? Let me tell you a little bit more about slave life. The slaves, the people that transported the sugar from one place to another, the sailors, many of them were black. Many of them were slaves. The people that served to sell this sugar in the marketplaces were also slaves. Messengers, carriage drivers, tradesmen, all of these people were black. Many of them were slaves. And as they traveled around, these black sailors across the Atlantic, these carriage drivers and messengers from plantation to plantation, they were not just carrying their master's words. They were carrying their own political ideology, their own ideas about just how this world had developed and just what it was going to become. And so what the planters knew, the slaves knew. Because what the planters discussed in their fancy dinners, at their lavish balls, who attended those balls, who brought them their food, who sat silently as they ate and listened to the conversation. Slaves permeated every part of this society, and the slaves here on the Louisiana coast were very aware of political developments